Today, I was supposed to teach a couple weeks ago, but Luke and I, we just had to reschedule our preaching calendar. And so I'm honestly extremely happy that it got moved to this section of Mark, because this is probably one of the more challenging sections of Mark to read, because we start seeing the disciples, these people we put on a pedestal and think so highly of, we start seeing them struggle with the same kind of things we struggle with, mainly doubt. Even in the midst of Jesus. So before we even dive into the reading today, I want to read a portion from 1 Corinthians 13. And this is going to really illustrate the theme of today's message. So 1 Corinthians 13:12, this is Paul speaking to the Corinthians, obviously. He says, now, meaning like while we're here on earth, we see things imperfectly, like puzzling reflections in a mirror. But then, meaning once we've died and we're reunited with Christ, we will see everything with perfect clarity. All that I know now is partial and incomplete. But then I will know everything completely, just as God knows me completely. So there's a lot to unpack here, but first part is that Paul is trying to illustrate that while we're on earth, we see things imperfectly, and he uses this illustration of a mirror. Some translations say, in a mirror darkly. And what Paul is referencing is, obviously back in Jesus' day, they didn't have mirrors the way that we think of mirrors. They would take a piece of brass or a piece of metal, and they would polish it to like a really high shine to where you could see your reflection in it, but like it's distorted. It may not be as like clear as just looking in glass. So like you see your reflection, but it's not a perfect reflection. It's an imperfect vision. It's kind of like if you've ever looked in a window and like the light is hitting you the right way, like you can use the mirror or use the window kind of as like a mirror. You're like, hey, check the fit, But if something's not hitting the light, like if there's something behind you that's not in the light, it's in shadow. And so it's like looking in your phone and like you're using your phone as like a mirror. It's like it can work, but it's imperfect. We don't really see everything that is there. We don't understand fully. So what Paul is saying is like, while we're here on earth, this is our understanding of God. Is like we have revelation. We know that he is the Messiah. He is the one, but we don't fully comprehend his plan for us here on earth, right? And that's what we struggle with. That's what causes doubt and frustration and confusion. And that's what we see the disciples struggling with through today's reading. So as we read, think about that as like struggling with not fully understanding what God's plan is, but ultimately trusting in that plan. So let's dive in. Mark 8:22 through 26. Jesus heals the blind man, and it says, when they arrived, meaning Jesus and the disciples, arrived at Bethsaida, some people brought a blind man to Jesus, and they begged him to touch the man and heal him. Jesus took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. That's important. Then, spitting on the man's eyes, he laid hands on him and asked, can you see anything now? The man looked around and he said, yes, I can see people, but I don't see them very clearly. They look like trees walking around. So his eyes were open, but there was no definitive features on people. They just looked like trees, kind of like walking around. So then Jesus laid hands on him, on the eyes again, and his eyes were opened, and his sight was completely restored, and he can see everything clearly. Jesus sent him away, saying, don't go back into the village. So there's three things we want to look at. Is one, why is Jesus spitting on people? Two, why didn't he heal him immediately? And then three, why did he tell him not to go back to the village? So let's start with the beginning. Why is Jesus spitting on people? I've seen lots of those healing conferences with like Benny Hinn, and like other pastors, like they'll have people who are blind or have other ailments or whatever, and I've seen these pastors like spit in their hand and then like lay spit on them and stuff like that. And I'm like, that would probably make me a little hesitant, but I guess if I can't see you doing it, what am I going to do? But I think there's this concept of like Jesus spat on this man because like his spit is holy and divine or whatever. And as much as I think that's a beautiful, reverent attitude towards Jesus, I think it's far more practical than that. People who are blind, a lot of the times their tear ducts don't function properly, and if their eyes are shut for a long time, crust can build up. Honestly, I think ultimately Jesus spit on this man's eyes to clear the crust away from his eyes. I mean, I think so. And I know that seems like, well, that's not very exciting. I'm like, well, we have to understand something. At this point, Jesus had gained quite a following, and he had gained quite a notoriety, right? Positive and negative. And there were plenty of people who would love to come find a reason to say, this guy's not who he says he is. There's plenty of people who would love to find fault in Jesus so they can say, see, he's just a false prophet. He's just a magician. He's just this little guru guy trying to work these false miracles. So Jesus, knowing this, I think truly was like, well, I'm going to wipe the crust from this guy's eyes and ask him, can you see now? And when the guy opens his eyes and he says, well, I can see, but everything's real blurry, that confirmed to everyone around them, oh no, he's actually blind. As opposed to if Jesus was like, you're healed, and they walk away and he wipes his eyes of the crust and opens them and goes, I can see. They could easily say, oh, no, see, he wasn't actually blind. He just had crust in his eyes. And I think Jesus is wise enough to understand that everywhere he turns, there's scrutiny. And so Jesus is thinking, why perform a miracle where what practicality could help, right? So Jesus wipes his eyes, asks if he can see, confirms to everybody that he actually can't. Jesus lays his hands on him again and heals him. Okay, so that explains the spitting. But it does make me question, well, why didn't he just do it all at once though? I understand, okay, from some degree, we have scrutiny from people, and so he's trying to make it confirmed that the guy was indeed blind, but Jesus could heal. Why did he have the man open his eyes and everything's blurry? And scholars would argue, and based on my research, that this is an illustration of how the disciples and how we, going back to 1 Corinthians 13, this is how we see God as we stumble through the earth, right? We have this revelation. We recognize God as God. We recognize Jesus as the Messiah, as our Savior. We have that confirmation. Our eyes are opened, but things remain blurry. We see things imperfectly. We recognize God for who he is, but at the same time, a lot of these things that God asks us to do, a lot of these commandments that he's given, a lot of these stories that we read about, not all of it fits inside of our box, right? A lot of it is well, why did Jesus say that? Why did God ask the Israelites to do that? So we struggle with this idea of yes, I believe you are the one, right? God, you are God. Of course you're God. You created the universe. You created the foundations of the earth. You knit me together in my mother's womb. But this thing you're asking me to do is it doesn't really fit with my expectations of what you would ask me to do, right? So that's where we find ourselves today, is exploring how the disciples and how we walk with Jesus through life, understanding imperfectly of what he's asked us to do. So before we move on to the next part, Jesus says, don't go back into the village. We're going to see that 3 times today where Jesus tells people hey, don't go tell anybody about this. Don't say anything about this. And again, to dispel any hyper spirituality, I think honestly, Jesus knew what he had to do. Jesus understood the mission of coming to suffer and die and to be raised again, and his disciples did not. His disciples had a much different view and desire for what they wanted Jesus to accomplish, and the Jews of this day also had a different desire of what they wanted the Messiah to accomplish, and we'll see that here in a little bit. So I think Jesus was telling people not to go tell people because he was aware of the fact that the spiritual view of what the Messiah came to do and the human point of view of what the Messiah came to do were in contrast with one another and would cause more harm than good if they started spreading this around. So it'll be revealed a little bit better as we keep going, but let's keep going. So let's look at 8:27 through 30. Jesus and his disciples left Galilee, so after they healed the blind man, they leave Galilee and they went up to the villages near Caesarea Philippi. As they were walking along, he asked them, all of the disciples, who do people say that I am? Well, they replied, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, and others say you are one of the other prophets. Then he asked them, and by them it's a plural form of who do you say I am? Who do you say I am? All of you. And Peter is the first one to speak up, and he says, you are the Messiah. But Jesus warned them not to tell anybody, confirming, yes, you're right. He's like, you are the Messiah. And he's like, yeah, don't go tell anybody that though, okay? So Peter just has this revelation of you are the Messiah. You are. All these other people are saying all these other things, but I say you are the Messiah. And it's funny, we don't see the other disciples necessarily coming out and saying that as well. What are they saying? Well, some say you're John the Baptist, some say you're Elijah, some say you're another prophet. But Peter is bold enough to speak up and say, you are the Messiah. Peter's just made this bold proclamation in front of all the other disciples, like, you are that guy. And then we see Jesus in verse 31 start into this explanation of what the Messiah is coming to doing. Then Jesus began to tell them that the Son of Man must suffer many terrible things and be rejected by the elders, the leading priests, and the teachers of the religious law. He would be killed, but 3 days later he would rise from the dead. As he talked about this openly with his disciples, and what that word means, like openly, means like typically he's talking in parables, his disciples are listening to these stories. He's speaking plainly. He's not talking in riddles. He's not using metaphors. He's saying, I, the Son of Man, will suffer, will die, will rise again in 3 days. And so Peter took him aside as he's speaking openly, and he starts reprimanding him, which is like, again, Peter speaks out first, and we're going to see this as we go along. Peter is just one of those people who acts before he thinks. He speaks before he thinks, but he has good intentions. And so I can imagine Peter's pulling Jesus aside, and he's like, hey, man, stop telling people you're going to die. Because at this time, the Jews had this list, and they still do. They have this list of things that the Messiah will come to accomplish. They've got a list of things, of these boxes that the Messiah must tick in order to be the guy, in order to be the Messiah. One of those things is that the Messiah is going to come as a ruler, and it can be interpreted as a political ruler, as a general kind of thing, or general of an army, like a military type ruler. And so at this time, the Jews in Israel would be clinging really strongly to that one promise in particular, because the Romans ruled Israel at this time. And that was a bad thing for two reasons. One, the Romans were pagans, so they went completely against any sort of Jewish religious ideology. And two, they were taxing the Jews into poverty. The Jews did not like the fact that the Romans were ruling over the Holy Land, that they were not believers. And so this thirst for overthrowing the Roman government would be really strong in the Jewish community. So this idea of the Messiah, the one thing they're clinging to at this point is we want somebody to come and overthrow the Roman government and reestablish this Israel kingdom and put somebody on the throne, and Israel's on top of the world again and we rule over the Holy Land. And so for Peter to say, you're the Messiah, and then for the very next sentence, Jesus saying, well, yeah, I'm going to suffer and die, goes in stark contrast to the expectation of becoming a ruler of a kingdom, right? So I think what Peter's saying is he's pulling Jesus aside, and he's like, hey, Jesus, you and me, I'm down. I am your ride or die. But these other guys over here, they may not, keep following you if you keep saying stuff like this. There are some expectations you're supposed to be meeting, right? You can't be saying you're going to die and, you're going to raise again. That kind of, you need to be overthrown to the Romans, right? And so what does Jesus do? His famous line, he turns away from Peter, and he's addressing all the disciples, and he says, get away from me, Satan, which is kind of harsh, right? I mean, I can imagine being Peter, best of intentions, trying to talk to Jesus, and he's like, get away from me, Satan, and be like, all right, that was harsh. That was hurtful. But Jesus goes on to say, you are seeing things merely from a human point of view and not from God's. And I could just imagine Israel being under the control of Rome for so long. I can imagine, to fantasize about the Roman government being overthrown and this new king coming in and Israel being on top again and being the greatest nation in the world, ruling over the Holy Land. Yeah, that sounds pretty good. But what Jesus is illustrating to them is have you forgotten the whole purpose of your existence right now? Have you forgotten why your ancestors went through the desert, built the tabernacle, why we had the temple? Are you not waiting for the Messiah? But you're more worried about having a great government? You're more worried about raising up a king? He's like, can you not see that the king has come? Can you not see that I've come to do everything that you've ever hoped for, and you're so narrow-minded you're worried about politics? So that's why he calls Peter Satan. He's saying, you are solely of this world, and your desires are solely of this world. You've completely missed the point. The Messiah is standing right in front of you, and all you care about is politics. And so I'm sure, that's hurt. Peter's hurt at this point. But we keep going and we see Jesus not only addressing Peter and then addressing the disciples, but then it begins addressing the crowds around him. And he says, he's trying to set the record straight. He's like, look, if any of you want to be my follower, you must give up your own way. You must take up your cross and follow me. I want to pause there just for a second. It's so funny because we only read this verse from like a 20th century perspective, right? We talk about, you got to take up your cross daily, right? You got to take up your cross and do what you have to do in order to serve the Lord. But we see it from a biased point of view because we see taking up your cross as like a righteous thing because we know that Jesus took his cross, died, paid for our sins, and was resurrected, right? So we see that as like a glorious thing. We see it as a redemptive thing. We have to understand, Jesus hasn't been crucified yet. So the disciples and the group that he's talking to right now don't have that reference. Jesus is essentially saying, you have to go and experience one of the most painful elements of torture if you want to follow me. It would be like saying, we don't really have torture methods anymore, but it more similar, more relevant to our daily. It would be like saying, you need to go to the gallows and have the noose put around your neck and be hung for your beliefs if you're going to follow me. This is an extremely brutalistic illustration that Jesus is giving. There's no redemption yet because Jesus hasn't risen yet. So the people following him, surely listening to this, are going this is intense. This is quite an ask at this point, right? He says, but if you give up your life for my sake and for the sake of the good news, you will save it. And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but lose your own soul? What do you benefit if Israel becomes the greatest nation on earth, but you've completely missed the fact that the Messiah is here to save your soul? It's like, if you're so caught up in Israel culture and having a kingdom and giving it back to the Romans and telling them to get out of your holy land, if that's more important to you, you've completely missed it, and you've given up your soul. Is there anything worth more than your soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my message in these adulterous and sinful days, the Son of Man will be ashamed of that person when he returns in glory of his Father with the holy angels. So he's saying that these are adulterous and sinful days. Who's in power? Romans. Who is in power of the Jews? The Pharisees, these whitewashed tombs, these people who have very, if non-existent relationship spiritually with God the Father, but they have this really good-looking religious life, right? They stand on the corners and preach, and they give money openly, and they dress the right way, and they keep the holy days. And God is saying, Jesus is saying, these are adulterous and sinful days. All of this stuff the Pharisees are doing is meaningless to me. Y'all are so tied up in things that are happening on earth, you can't see the spiritual impact of me standing in front of you and what I plan to do for you. And not only that, the Messiah has come and he's told you exactly what he's going to do to fulfill the prophecy and the law. And you're saying, no, don't do that. We don't want that. No, do something else instead. Don't do that. Don't do that. My son, Hezi, he's I think I've mentioned this before. He's in this I need it stage. Everything is, he goes, I can touch it? I go, no, you can't touch it. It will kill you. You cannot touch it. And he's like, I need to touch it. And I was like, no, you don't need to touch it. Okay, I promise you. It's not going to do what you think it's going to do. And afterwards, you're going to regret it. So obviously, being a father, there's so many illustrations I can use. Looking at my son and just seeing this idea of I know what's good for you. And I know that you have this concept of what you want, and you want it so badly. He wants candy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And I'm trying to explain to him, no, it's not good for you. He's like, no, I want sugar. And I'm like, no, because then you run around the house and throw things, and then you're cranky all day long. It feels good in the moment. And yeah, man, thinking about it, I would really like to have a lollipop for breakfast and a bag of Skittles for lunch. Yeah, I know it sounds good, and it might even taste good going down. But ultimately, you've lost it. You don't have the nourishment that you need. You're not growing the way that you need to grow. Jesus is showing his disciples, he's like, you guys, you can't have sugar for breakfast, okay? You have to understand, you've missed the concept of what's going on here. I have something so much better planned for you. I have so much better planned for you, and you're worried about whether you can have Skittles for lunch. Are you out of your mind? And so we see 6 days later, in chapter 9, verse 2, 6 days later, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John and led them up to a high mountain to be alone. As the men watched, Jesus' appearance was transformed and his clothes became dazzling white, far whiter than any earthly bleach could ever make them. Then Elijah and Moses appeared and began talking with Jesus. Peter exclaimed, "Rabbi, it's wonderful for us to be here. Let us make 3 shelters as memorials, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He said this because he didn't really know what else to say. Peter just starts talking. He's overwhelmed. Again, he's that guy who's he's not really thinking, he's just acting. And he's like, "Oh, neat. Can I build you a house? You want a place to sit? You want a snack? This is wonderful that this is happening. What can I do? What can I do? What can I do? What can I do?" And it's I think we can look at Peter, especially in these passages we've looked at, and we can too, I don't think that we're any better than Peter. I know there's those times where we struggle with tough situations or with doubt, and we want to say, man, if I was one of the apostles, if I was one of the disciples and I was able to walk with Jesus, I definitely wouldn't doubt. I would be there with it, right? There's no way. Or if I heard Jesus speak to me in the desert, there's no way I wouldn't listen to him. And we want to think that we would be better than Moses and David and Peter, when in reality, we're just as bad as they are. Just as bad. And it's we had David, a man after God's own heart, an adulterer, a murderer. We have Solomon, wisest man in the world, built one of the most beautiful versions of the temple, massive fornicator, had 600 concubines or something like that. Then we have Peter, who walks with Jesus and claims that he's the Messiah. He's the one who speaks out of boldness and saying, "No, you're the Messiah." Yet the night that Jesus is arrested, people are like, "Hey, don't you know that Jesus guy?" He's like, "No, I don't know that guy." Not me. I don't know who that guy is. What a stark contrast. He walked with Jesus. But what happened? He doubted. We see Peter walking on water. He doubted. We see Paul, who we tout as this great theologian, one of the greatest people in Christian history because he wrote the majority of the New Testament. He's probably killed more Christians than anybody else in the Bible. So it's we look at these people and we're like, man, God used a bunch of broken people to do his will. It's well, yeah, who else does he use? He doesn't have anyone else available. There's nobody that we've encountered on earth in your existence or anywhere in this text where we could have said, now that would have been a good prophet, or that would have been the perfect disciple. There's absolutely nobody, because there's nobody perfect who can fit into the mold that would be required to be who? Jesus. Jesus was the only Jesus, so we can't look back at these disciples and go, what a bunch of dum-dums. We're the dum-dums. You would have been the same way. You would have either been Peter or David or whatever. We are the same people. There's nothing about the fact that they walked with Jesus or they heard directly from God that makes them any closer to perfection. They were just people chosen for that particular circumstance, which one should show you, don't doubt your importance in life, because Jesus can utilize you. And also don't beat yourself up about doubt, because we're looking at people who walked with Jesus, who saw the fulfillment of the law, who still struggled with doubt, right? So as he's being transfigured, Peter's like, oh, let's build a house or whatever. And then it says, then a cloud overshadowed them. This is verse 7. And a voice from the cloud said, this is my dearly loved son. Listen to him. Suddenly, when they looked around, Moses and Elijah were gone, and they saw only Jesus, obviously, the Son. And I've got to think, in that moment, Peter's going, oh, okay. So when I reprimanded him about not saying that stuff, God is now telling me, listen to him. So what he's saying is true. Oh, okay. And it's funny to me that only Peter, James, and John were there to witness the transfiguration. It's really interesting. And I don't know this for sure. This is just me being literature major and analyzing text. Because as they leave the mountain and they start going back down, in verse 14 it says, when they arrived to the other disciples, so the other disciples were down doing their thing, said they saw a large crowd surrounding them, and some teachers of the religious law were arguing with them. When the crowd saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with awe, and they ran to greet him. Jesus says, what is all this arguing about? One of the men in the crowd spoke up and said, teacher, I brought my son so that you could heal him. He is possessed by an evil spirit that won't let him talk. And whenever the spirit seizes him, it throws him violently to the ground. Then he foams at the mouth and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast out the evil spirit, but they couldn't do it. And Jesus responds, you faithless people, how long must I be with you? How long must I put up with you? Bring the boy to me. Man, this is a tough verse to read from a perspective of like, Jesus is responding in a way that like, if I responded this way to like my wife or to a friend, I would repent of it later. Like, he's kind of being hard. He's like, I am so sick of being with you guys. Like, literally like, how much longer do I have to be on earth? Like, when can I die? When can I die and be done with you guys? I'm so sick of you. I can't even right now. Like, are you serious? You can't heal this kid? Are you kidding me? Like, that's what it seems like to me, right? But I have to go, okay, Jesus is perfect. Jesus never sinned. And so what I have to conclude is that Jesus' anger in this passage is righteous anger. And so I'm like, okay, so all right, Jesus is angry, but it's righteous anger. Why is his anger righteous? Because that means that the disciples are doing something wrong. And something wrong that they frankly know better than to be doing. And as I studied and as I looked through this, I had to see, okay, what were the disciples doing when he came down from the mountain? It says, a large crowd was surrounding them, and some teachers of the religious law were arguing with them. So there's this boy who's demon-possessed, who's writhing on the ground, who's foaming at the mouth, who's clearly in pain. And when Jesus came down from the mountain, were they laying hands and praying? Were the other religious leaders reading texts and praying? No. They were arguing. What were they arguing about? Well, seeing as the disciples they couldn't heal this kid, they're probably arguing about the proper method. Well, technically, you should have laid hands on his head and then prayed Psalm 12. And the disciples are saying, no. No, Jesus showed us like this. We actually spit on our hand and then we rub it on his eyes and then that's going to cure him. And they're like, no, you don't spit on his hand. No. So they're spending time arguing with each other rather than focusing on healing the hurt and the broken that's laying on the ground writhing in pain. And so I think Jesus' frustration is, are you kidding me? It doesn't matter whether you're sprinkled or fully submerged to be baptized. It doesn't matter whether the communion wine is juice or real wine. It doesn't matter whether or not you go through confirmation or you just get baptized the next. It does not matter. You guys, we have these churches, like we have so many denominations of churches because we have died on so many different hills that we've said, no. Our way is right and you guys are wrong. So much so, me and my church friends are going over here to start this church and we're going to do it this way. And it's like, guys, are you kidding me? While we have homeless people who are not being fed, while we have sick people who don't have money to pay their bills. I mean, I know I'm getting really intense. I understand. But I'm just saying, do we not understand we've missed the point if we're spending our time arguing with fellow Christians about trivial things that clearly Jesus doesn't care about? Jesus is like, what are you arguing about? There's a kid writhing on the floor. Just help him. Help him, period. That is it. You've missed the point if you think that you need to stand here and be right against these arguably wrong religious leaders at the time, right? It's like we have these Pharisees who don't have a spiritual connection with God. We have these religious leaders who are far more concerned with the ways of the law and doing things properly. We don't work on the Sabbath and all this than actually helping people. And Jesus is like, you've missed it. No wonder he's frustrated. He's like, after all this, this is what you care about, being right. Whose side are you on? You've missed it. And so then Jesus says, bring the boy to me. So they brought the boy, but when the evil spirit saw Jesus, it threw the child into a violent convulsion, and he fell to the ground, writhing and foaming at the mouth. How long has this been happening? Jesus asked the boy's father. He replied, since he was a little boy. The spirit often throws him into the fire or into the water, trying to kill him. Have mercy on us and help us if you can. What do you mean, if I can? Jesus asked. Anything is possible if a person believes. And the father instantly cried out, I do believe, but help me overcome my unbelief. This is the first time, I think it's the first time, or the only time, when Jesus is performing a miracle of healing, that he pushes back on the person's faith in the matter. Because a lot of people that Jesus healed, arguably, probably weren't even Jews. More than likely. But then we see people like the woman who grabs his robe to be healed, to end her bleeding. She had such faith that just touching his robe would cause healing, right? Or he talks to the Roman soldier who says, I need to heal my servant. And Jesus says, I will go see him. And he says, no. I know, if you say it's going to be done, it'll be done. And Jesus says, I've never seen greater faith in Israel. But we've never seen him push back on somebody. So the dad says, help me if you can. And I can imagine, being a parent, I can see I can imagine my son writhing in pain on the ground and going to Jesus and being like, man, I don't want to bother you. Could you do something about this if you're not too busy? And what is the heart behind that? It's like the dad probably recognizes Jesus is who he says he is, but at the same time, he's struggling with feeling as though he's worthy of asking the Messiah to heal his son. And I think that's why Jesus pushes back and he says, what do you mean if I can? Anything is possible for a person who believes. And the father responds, Lord, I do believe, but I'm also aware of the fact that my belief is probably not where it needs to be. I do believe, but I also have doubts, Lord, and I feel guilty about that. And Jesus heals him, which shows Jesus understands that the key is not that you are perfectly in line with the law and that you are without doubt. Doubt is natural, and Jesus understands that because we're human. There's no way we could possibly understand every intimate detail of how God functions. It's a being that we cannot even comprehend. Go Google understanding 4D quantum physics and stuff like that, and your mind will explode in 12 minutes. There's no way we can understand God fully. It's just not. There's just things that we are not built to totally comprehend. And Jesus understands that. And what is the Father's heart? Recognizing that I have my doubts, but Lord, I want to trust you regardless. Lord, help my unbelief. In verse 25, it says, when he saw the crowd of onlookers was growing, he rebuked the evil spirit and said, listen, you spirit that makes this boy unable to hear and speak. I command you to come out of the child and never enter him again. Then the spirit screamed and threw the boy into another violent convulsion and left him. The boy appeared to be dead. A murmur ran through the crowd as people said, he's dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and helped him to his feet, and he stood up. Afterward, when Jesus was alone in his house with the disciples, they asked him, why couldn't we cast out this evil spirit? And Jesus replied, this can only be cast out by prayer. That's interesting, because they had performed miracles before, no doubt. The disciples had healed people. It wasn't something that was exclusively to Jesus. There's evidence, the disciples healed people. So this wasn't a first-time thing. It wasn't you just didn't know that you had to do prayer. I think it all roots back to that moment where Jesus, says, yeah, I'm the Messiah, you're right. And then goes on to explain, but as the Son of Man, I will suffer and die. And I think a seed of doubt was sown in that moment amongst the disciples because, again, it went in stark contrast against what their earthly understanding of what the Messiah was. And so from that point to the point where they're healing this boy, it's been 6 days. And I can only imagine, knowing myself, that this person that I've been following, this person that I've been looking up to, this person that I've been trusting, who I've recognized as the Messiah, the person that my entire being is relying upon, now starts saying things that go against my expectations of him, surely I would start to doubt. And I would start to question, am I following the right guy? Is this the guy? Is this the Messiah? Or is this a different Messiah? And so I can only imagine that as those disciples went to heal this child, because Jesus says this can only be healed by prayer. What is prayer? Prayer is communion with God, a reliance on him, a submission to his will instead of our own will. So I can only imagine these disciples went to heal this boy, and they're so caught up in their own doubt, their frustrations, that rather than relying on God in the midst of this healing, I think that they're just going through the motions. Hey, we've done this before. Okay, I know how to heal people, da-da-da-da. And then when it doesn't work, in the midst of that doubt, rather than focusing on doing what is right, which is healing the boy, they get caught up in what? Arguing about religious nonsense with these other religious leaders. And so I think the key that we take away from this, though we see through a mirror darkly, though we see these reflections, and though we see fuzzy images, we recognize Jesus is the Messiah. We recognize our life is committed to following Jesus. But we come up against these circumstances where we go, I don't quite understand this, God. I don't quite understand why you would ask me to do this, why you would cause me so much pain, why you would put me in the midst of such a sorrowful situation. I don't understand, God. It's okay to have that feeling. It's okay to have that feeling of, I don't understand. The key is understanding that we see these reflections darkly, but in the midst of that, walking in faith. It's in the midst of seeing things with a blurred vision, walking forward in faith, trusting that Jesus is going to lead us through the way and all that we need to see. I think it's also an interesting illustration, the fact that the blind man saw things, but they were blurry, because I think it's an illustration of how Jesus walks us through life. Is like he doesn't give us this like, okay, so now you've accepted me. Okay, this is the day you're going to die, and these are all the things you're going to do before then, okay? No, what does he do? He puts us in a position where he says, wake up, my graces are renewed every day. Give us this daily bread, because that's the relationship that's required to get us through these doubts. What Jesus is saying is, these doubts are inevitable. Of course you're going to doubt. You're human. You're not built to live separately from me. You must live with me every day, reliant on me in the midst of these doubts, because that's the only way that we can function. We have to rely on him. It's like being blind and being led by somebody. He is the one that can lead us. Otherwise, we're just stumbling through a room. Bree and I were talking the other day. We were talking about like how we handle problems and the different way we handle problems. And I was saying like, it seems to me like the way that you handle problems is like somebody tells you to go into this room, and the room is pitch black, and there's a light switch on the other side of the room, but there's a lot of obstacles, and you can't see them. And the second you come up to an obstacle, you trip and fall, and you cry, and you go, I can't do this. And I'm like, I, on the other hand, like trip and fall and kick and hurt myself and do absolutely everything I can to struggle to find the light switch, and I'm just like moving around in the dark aimlessly. And I was like, that's kind of how we live our Christian life to some degree, is like this, we're walking through this darkened room, and we're trying to get to this switch. And ultimately, we can't see what's in front of us. We can't navigate unless there's somebody else in the room with us who can see and who can walk us around these obstacles and can lead us towards this ultimate goal that we have. But if we rely on our own understanding and our own vision and the things that we can perceive, we're ultimately going to stumble and find ourselves lost in the dark.